good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to the Washington Outsider. With you today is the host. My name is Irina Zuckerman. I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. And also with us is Abdi Daoud. He has written an excellent article about diplomacy between Somaliland and Washington. Uh, whether we can arrive at a win-win solution or whether it's better to have no deal at all. Abdi is a software engineer and he's a non-resident scholar at the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. Abdi, let's start, but if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you've arrived at writing this excellent paper, and then we'll get into the background of the situation and how you've decided to how you've decided to that this is the pathway towards creating creating, forging, and maintaining good relations between Somaliland and the U.S.
Thank you very much, Irina, and welcome everyone. My name is Abdurrahman Mohammed Abdi Dawood. I'm a software engineer. I've been working with Somaliland advocacy actually from young age. So from Somaliland and SNM movement, you will see a common practice that you are professional in one hand and building your own career. And on the other hand, you're trying to help and advocate with your country and whatever issues you are passionate about. So growing up in my home when I was young, there was the flag of the SNM in our house, and I was wondering what does that mean. And my father would explain to me about the struggle that Somaliland people have gone to gain their independence and sovereignty. So I started with from young age with being involved with 18 May celebrations. At one point, I had co-founded the first Arabic Somaliland news website. But more recently, what I've been more involved in is advocacy and letting people know about what Somaliland sovereignty means, and the great accomplishment the Somaliland Foreign Ministry and Somaliland government has done in the past years. It's really the time to talk about to the whole world about what Somaliland is and why Somaliland exists. So about this document, as you mentioned, is about talking about the relationship between Somaliland and the United States. And what's new about this is actually a quite advanced topic. It's talking about really the options, the diplomacy that the Somaliland and the United States can foresee so that they could, work on their interests. The document doesn't really talk about what are the interests exactly of the common interests between Somaliland and the United States. Also, it doesn't really talk about Somaliland, obviously. So it's one of my blogging items. So if you like, we could talk about Somaliland if you like, and we can arrive at what Somaliland is for the greater audience.
I think that would be a great idea. I think many people may have heard of Somalia. They may have even heard of Somaliland. That both countries are in the Horn of Africa. But beyond that, I think most people don't really know the difference, and they don't really know the history. And there may be a confusion. There's a lot of talk about separatism, secessionism, and why it's not. But most don't understand why it's not really the case.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if you open a Wikipedia article, first off, it will tell you that Somaliland is a de facto sovereign state located in East Africa, something along the line of being neighbored by Ethiopia in the south and east, and the west, and Djibouti in the west, and Somalia in the east. And then it will go into saying that Somaliland is not internationally recognized. And in 1960, you had two countries that got independence. So it's Somaliland, which was a British protectorate, and Somalia, which was an Italian colony. And the story goes along that line that after just 5 days, both of these countries joined together to form the Somali Republic. And it stays for 29 years. And after that, Somaliland became independent, declared a unilateral declaration of independence, which we say that it's not recognized and de jure recognition, while in fact, it also will talk about the relationship, the de facto relationship that Somaliland had. I have a problem with this definition because it doesn't really give, although it's fact, it's based on fact, but it actually missed important milestones to understand what is Somaliland to begin with, before we talk about the difference between Somaliland and Somalia. And I like to go back in point in time. For example, if you go in the 1500s, you would see the map quite as well, very different things that you will see there. So you'll see there's the Aden Empire, which was the Adal Empire. Mainly now it's in the areas of Western Somaliland ports. And this was an empire that was independent from the Ajuran Empire, for example, which also existed at the same time and was centered around Mogadishu and southern Somalia. So even for so if you look for the 500 years, what you find that is these two centers of civilization or people, they've always been independent from each other. There was no history prior to 1960 that these two regions of these people, they were under one political entity. So someone from Europe or someone who believes in ethno-nationalism will actually automatically think that, oh, this is Somali people and they've been divided by, the colonialism. But that's far from the truth, because you can see that within 500 years, all what you had is a very small 30 years that they had union. And I'll come back to that union and what it meant and what was the goal behind it. But it's important to understand that when we are recognizing Somaliland, we are recognizing the norm, the original, the default setting for these people, and the exception is actually putting it together. And I hope to explain at this point that this is as odd as if we force any two other countries to be one when they are actually different. So Somalilanders often give the example of Egypt and Syria, which are both countries that speak Arabic language, both Muslim countries, but eventually they've tried to be united and that didn't work. And that's quite similar to Somaliland and Somalia. So if I talk about that union itself, people would argue that it's quite fantastic. Like, it happened within 5 days that Somaliland united with Somalia, although, in the legal aspect, when we look at it, it didn't actually happen. That act of union was not ratified. It happened within 5 days. Now, the important question to ask ourselves, how come it took just 5 days then? And now we have actually more than 31 years that Somaliland and Somalia are separate. So to understand that question is to really, we have to go back again, another milestone that gets often forgotten about, which is in 1954. And what happened in that year is that the United Kingdom has given away about 1/3 what was originally Somaliland to Ethiopia. And this is just 6 years before independence. And Somalilanders were really furious about that. So their goal was, let's unite with the nearest country, Somalia, and let's fight with Ethiopia and try to gain that land, which is called Hold and Reserve Area. So that's the motive, actually, for Somalilanders to unite. And now what happens is there's no actually any motive. So first of all, we talked about that they're back to the original, natural, historical thing of being always independent. So why Somaliland wants to be independent? It always been independent, and now there's actually no motive to unite with Somalia, and that, let alone the genocide that happened in 1988, where a Somalian dictator went and killed several civilians in Hargeisa and Bro.
So before we get to the very little known genocide in Somaliland, what happened with the territory that Ethiopia acquired at Somaliland's expense? How did that, was it ever recovered? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so there was a fight that happened in 1977, a war between Somalia and, so when I say Somalia, that means the Somali Republic, the union of these two countries, and that has ended in a defeat. And what happened after that is many events that will lead to the collapse of the Somali Republic. So it's important to understand that Somaliland went to this union for a reason, and that is no longer the case, because Somalia as well, after the end of the war, has made a treaty with Ethiopia, giving those rights forever to Ethiopia. So this case was finished and done, a history that we put behind us. And it also means that Somaliland now is back to its original status. And if anyone expects Somaliland to go in the union with Somalia, which is a crazy idea, as I explained, is as random as any two countries being forced, there's no any incentive as it was in 1960. So I would say that the most basic form of respect to people is actually to call them by who they are. And Somalilanders are just Somalilanders. But if we try to, project other concepts, which I definitely argue that ethno-nationalism, the idea that ethnic group should be one country regardless of any other conditions or history, is a foreign idea. It's an imposed idea on Somalilanders, and what they want is just to recognize again for who they are. So if I go back to that history, the 76 history under the UK or the British Empire being a British protectorate, that was an indirect rule. And the funny thing is, this again another milestone that's been ignored is in 1827. That's when a vessel has been attacked from the UK, been attacked by local clans in Somaliland. And so you will see the first treaty that happened between the two was from the British. It was something like friendship between the British Empire and Habrawal clan. So that's what they identified with, and that's what they saw. They didn't see any a king or a structure of Somali people that was grand. It's just that clan. And later on, after the Berlin Conference and what happened there, you will see that British as well went and entered with formed treaties between the UK and several clans, which make up Somaliland today. And that's why that war and that the furiously that Somaliland felt, there was a treaty between them and the UK to protect their land. So when they give away to Ethiopia, that was really something that explains a lot of this hasty and emotional union that happened, and which Somalilanders regret. And it's now past. Somaliland has been more independent now than it was with that union, and Somaliland is all now positive. And that's what we're discussing today, of how we could forge and solidify more relationship between Somaliland and the world.
So that brings us to the question of the genocide that happened in the late 80s. How did that come about, and specifically what brought what brought it to that particular point, and why is it so little known outside those countries?
Yeah. So what happened then is Siad Barre has been following the USSR, and communism was the norm in Somalia, and that comes about with a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of oppression and people taken to jail for their own ideas. My father was one of the people that got jailed by Siad Barre, and a lot of people who were in this cell, they were executed only just for their own opinion or just saying something different. So Somalilanders have suffered a lot from that, especially after the war with Ethiopia, and they've been targeted by the regime, their businesses, their activists, and so on. So it started with a civil uprising, and that also got attacked. People were killed. There's a Jazeera massacre that happened in the southern Somalia, which many elite people were executed. So later on, this is when the uprising comes and Somali national movements comes in. It was always ready for negotiation when it's needed, but with this regime, that was never an option, and that led to a conflict and fighting. And the SNM managed to return the major capitals in Somaliland, like Hargeisa and Boro. And this was again after the war with Ethiopia, and in that particular year, which is 1988, which is when this land was signed off, and the deal was for Ethiopia that, hey, we will return SNM and we will give these people to you. Although SNM was operating on the land, but it was much financed by Somalilanders. So what happened there is that people felt the victory, and that wasn't taken easily by the regime. So they weren't attacking the civilians and the militia all together as one. So in Hargeisa, what had happened is the planes will take off from the airport and will go around and bomb the city itself. And that's very rare in history that you find an airplane taking off from a city and dropping bombs in the same city that it took from. So we're talking about around, some people talk about 50,000, but when you ask the locals, it's about 100 to 200,000 civilians who were killed. And each Somalilander, they have their story. They will tell you about the horrors that they've gone through, all their loved ones back home. And it's something that obviously hasn't been talked about a lot. That time there wasn't the internet. But one thing to call out is that the state of Israel has actually mentioned this in the United Nations in the documents available there, talking about the human rights abuses in that year by the Somali government. So that's the only time that someone talked about it. But now it's a topic that always Somalilanders are really like to share with the world so that people know what happened.
My understanding is that ultimately, as a result of that intervention, UN did recognize those events as a genocide. Why wasn't there any action taken against perpetrators by the international community?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, the human rights has talked about that, but obviously, yeah, this is a time when Somalia was, it shifted its alignment from the Soviet Union to the United States. So it enjoyed some sort of, I won't say protection, but it was at that time seen as an ally. Yeah, it's unfortunate that no one has picked it up at that time. A lot of things you can see that we are talking now 88 to 91. There's a lot of things, events that was going on in the world. And sadly, wasn't surfaced. But again, opportunities today available for us to talk about and see how can this be, at least prosecute those people who are behind it. A lot of them today are in Farmajo's government, which is also tells you that it's still the Somalia has not really repented or, seriously taken into consideration of recognizing this genocide.
Interestingly enough, while Somalia was dealing with the jihadist movements that ultimately led to US intervention and Black Hawk Down and training of specific groups and so on and so forth, the history that we all know, Somaliland has evaded this ideological proliferation of extremism and continued to remain separate from those events. How were they able to do that?
So there's a lot of Somalilanders believe that Somaliland retained a lot of its customs and a lot of its culture. And the culture there is to, first of all, it's all around the clans. So, and when we talk about the clans, it's not only just, for example, the head of the clan, but there are a few elites from each clan that are known, like from that history that I talked about. And there was a lot of wars and peace deals between Somalilanders. So if you read some of the articles there, you will see that there was a lot of bloody history. You can imagine a pastoral society that had cycles of drought. People will fight over land and livestock. But that has evolved Somalilanders to have a way to govern themselves. And you will see that if you came up with an idea, you would need to sit with the elites of your clan, for example, and have that conversation about what needs to be done. So for a terrorist group to infiltrate Somaliland, they will find that really difficult. But there's a sense of security as well between Somalilanders, and they see each one of them as responsible for peace. So when we talk about peace, Somalilanders really value that a lot. So it won't be something that will be taken lightly. So all of a sudden, the government and the police find that the civilians are actually the most powerful resource they have to fight terrorism or anything that leads to conflict. Another thing that you will see that is in Somalia, the problem is a lot of international intervention has happened. And you can think about a terrorism group as also another actor that managed to get into Somalia. Somalilanders, by also is another thing that they reject any sort of intervention by any political entity to control their ways of living or their ideologies, and that also contributed to this. Some people would argue that Italian colony has disrupted the systems in Somalia to have a similar configuration that Somaliland had, but that's also that's a good point as well.
I noticed most recently, as Somaliland has started making kind of international approach for recognition of its independence, the Farmajo government in Somalia has employed online activists, if not to say bots, to essentially first deny the genocide and kind of claim that it was either an inside job or it didn't happen at all, or that in fact the Somalilanders started it and they were actually trying to make war and all sorts of excuses. And the second point, denying its independence. And my question is, why? What possible motive could they have to hold on to a territory that is largely independent as it is, and not to mention that they're currently experiencing their own internal troubles, plus there's the Ethiopia civil war next door, so there are many other concerns to worry about other than Somaliland going from a de facto independent to being recognized. Why is the sudden outburst of nationalism that doesn't really have any roots in history or culture or reality on the ground, for that matter?
Yeah, it's mainly it's around deflection. So Somalia, especially the federal government of Somalia, is a failed state. It failed to protect its people, and instead of getting that focus and being accountable to fight a Shabab movement, it will always try to deflect to Somaliland. And usually whenever you find any smear campaign against Somaliland, behind the scenes, you'll see there's something going on. We know about, the selection fiasco, we'll call it an election in Somalia. Again, all of this is a way to, hide the problems and incompetency that the Farmajo government has and try to, put the lights on somewhere else. And they're taking advantage of the Somaliland, recognition that did not happen for the past 31 in terms of de jure recognition, although we say that this de facto recognized. So it's trying to leverage that and make a case of it. You will see these contradictions. So the leaders will talk about they are sorry about the atrocities, they call it that, that happened in Somaliland. And then later on, their bots or whoever works with them, they will try to deny it. So within themselves, the message is contradictory, and it just shows how they are. There's a lack of sincere of that apologies when they apologize in that way. So a lot of things have happened, as you mentioned, not just in the region, but within Somalia itself. We talk about the elections or this election never happening on time. You have the fight with the Shabab, which hasn't worked. You see also the federal government concept as well, which is a lot of people have argued that it's not the right structure for Somalia. But again, this is internal issues, but it doesn't get the focus and no one talks about it. So they just deflect and try to talk about Somaliland. It's funny that even if some journalist gets arrested, you will get a lot of coverage from that, from these online bots or army, while actually on the other side, you'll find people being assassinated by the regime. Like Ekran Tahlil, who was, a civil service in Somalia, and then it was, disappeared, and they blamed Al-Shabaab, and the Shabaab said, no, we haven't done that. So all these things require coverage, but that doesn't happen, and they try to deflect on Somaliland issues.
So basically, it's just a way to avoid scrutiny for other unrelated matters, even though there is no inherent advantage in trying to hold on to Somaliland. There's nothing. The countries are separate. They have distinct economies, distinct cultures, distinct political systems, and there's no real interdependency between them, one could say.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The economy, we haven't talked about it. They absolutely, Somaliland economy is based on the interactions with Ethiopia and the Arab Gulf, or the Arabic Peninsula, and it's been there for ages, for many centuries. So there isn't, the geographical distance have actually acted as an isolation layer between Somaliland and Somalia, especially on the centers of civilization, which is the focus I talked about. So yeah, there's no political history apart from that exception of 30 years in the past 500 years. And economic wise, Somaliland is more integrated with Eastern Ethiopia and Addis Ababa and the Arab countries than Somalia. So it's just, only what they have is a union that happened in the past that was not ratified. The United Nations obviously did not really give any attention to this area, and it just continues considering they're all one country, which is not right, and which we want to talk about. So they're just trying to leverage off top of that, but the people are not with them. We all know that the referendum that Somaliland had in 2001, it was 97% people said yes to Somaliland constitution and Somaliland independence.
Why didn't it pursue an active outreach to the West in 2001, right around the time of the referendum?
So at that time, Somaliland was really busy with state building, and that's been a focus of Somaliland in the past 10 years. So even the civil war, Somaliland, which we usually don't like to talk about, it contributed to the Somaliland structure, to have love for peace and understand that war can happen at any moment. So Somalilanders had adopted all this culture of dialogue and compromise and coming in the middle whenever a conflict arises. And that time in those years, the government, they had not only established the constitution, which is something Somalia till now hasn't achieved, and their constitution is still provisional. They managed to then, the following years, to start to do elections. So Somaliland has been focused on building the state in those years, rightfully. And also, we're talking a very a poor country. It didn't have all the resources to forge a foreign policy and at the same time build a state. So understandably, at that time, the focus has been internal. But with the government today, you'll see that a lot of focus is being given to foreign affairs. And there's actually, we have to talk about the 10 years that we have lost, which is maybe one of the topic that we could touch on, is the talks with Somalia, which sort of played as freeze the time for Somaliland while Somalia tried to just win time. And what you get from that is actually a lot of time has been wasted, which Somaliland could have used to discuss these ideas and explain the history and the problems that it has faced with Somalia, whether it's genocide or the referendum.
What were those talks about, and why did it take so long to come to the conclusion that we weren't going anywhere? What was being pursued exactly?
So yeah, it was in 2012 in the UK. Somaliland and Somalia came together, and with the help of the international community, they said, well, the Somalis, this is the term they currently use, they will resolve their conflicts between themselves. So what happened there is Somaliland took this as a way to, be a responsible member of the international community, to work with areas of security and things that are can build trust between the two countries. So it was bilateral in nature. But what happened later on, following years, that it has become actually a way for Somaliland to ask for permission for becoming independent. That's how it's been turned around. So if Somaliland talks to any other country, they will say, well, let's not talk about recognition because this is an issue between Somalis. So the talks the goal was to cooperate on common interest and bilateral in nature, have become a tool used against Somaliland to pursue its quest for recognition, which is a question to every independent state in the world. And every state in the world in the international relations has the option to recognize or not recognize Somaliland. But that 10 years has actually frozen Somaliland. And now it's really the time to end these talks because they are not served, they haven't served for the purpose they were created for in the beginning. So all the treaties that Somaliland, Somalia has signed has not been implemented by Somalia. There was a deal to share the airspace control 50% of the time with Somaliland and 50% with Somalia. I guess what happened, Somalia just took 100% of that share. And they broke that deal with Somaliland. So it's really something that didn't give anything to Somaliland, actually harmed its position in the world, and it's actually stopping us from proceeding and talking to people because this misconception that Somaliland and Somalia will resolve the issue of sovereignty. And for Somalilanders, that's not the case. It's not something Somaliland will ask any government, not just Somalia, for its sovereignty, and that's where we are today.
What was the final point that made it clear that not only can't anything come out of these talks, but it's time to actually actively pursue the international community and focus on recognition of independence?
So it happened, especially when Formaggio came in place, you'll see that he has, acted with a lot of hostility against Somaliland. And then there was the Djibouti Summit, which happened in 2020, and that also gave a last-minute, reconfiguration by Djibouti government and Ismail Omar Guelleh, and that gave maybe a little hope that things will be different, but that didn't happen. So it's a failure upon failure that's been going on, and now the only thing we are raising it for is literally it has been a decade. So this has to be ended. It's disrespectful to the people of Somaliland, and they are asking their government really to end it now. And this is, again, it's bilateral. That's why no one should make a fuss about it, because it's up to Somaliland to have peace or conflict with any other government. Is a sovereign state. So if it's for its right to say this is not working for us, it should be respected. And that will also open the discussion and talk about Somaliland and other nations and how they can forge relations.
So this issue first arose in the U.S. policy circles with some commentary by scholars on Horn of Africa issues, such as a paper that came out of the Heritage Foundation in the last couple of months. But prior to this recent scholarship, there wasn't much heard about any of that. Before approaching the US, has there been already a movement to try to get African Union support? And if so, what is the status of that?
Yes, that's a good question. So in Tahir Yala's time, this is in the early 2000 and all the way to 2011, you would have Somaliland has persuaded with a lot of contact in the African Union and African countries. And from that, the AU has sent a fact-finding mission. And that mission actually has went to Somaliland and visited different cities and talked to the people. And they came out with a very great report. And in that report, they mentioned that Somaliland is not a typical secession movement, but it's a special case. And also talked about the fact that the union was not ratified, and looked at all the other things that we talked about the history there. So their recommendation was to actually bring in a process, that's what they called for, to deal with the Somaliland case, because it's different and should not be seen that it's going to open the Pandora box of secession movements elsewhere. And that scholarly document from the foundation think tank has really used that information as well, and said that Somaliland actually is setting the standard really high for any other country that wants to get recognized, because we talk about a country that actually existed in the past, and a country that's been for 30 years has been stable and democratic. So Somaliland is setting the bar really, really high for almost to the degree that you say no one can pursue the same path. So the African Union did that. Unfortunately, many countries in Africa, and this has not been the focus. So no one acted on that report, but it's still valid. It's there available, and many scholars refer to that. And it's actually one of the reports that if you read it, you will totally be sold on Somaliland recognition. And it's a very important piece. But unfortunately, again, there's no action that's been followed by the African states. And this actually takes, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so this takes me to another point, that Somaliland is always seen as a little African state. But when you look at Somaliland, you will see that it actually belongs to multiple regions. It's part of the Indo-Pacific, the larger Indo-Pacific, that's now a very important focus if we, for many countries and in several continents. It's also part of the Red Sea geopolitical area, and that it's a very important, again, for international maritime time. It's near to the Middle East, and that's also another region. So Somaliland being recognized has an impact on multiple regions and not just Africa. So the idea that to just let this be an African issue is actually not right. And this is the time that to raise this issue to multiple countries and multiple regions to look at what Somaliland will bring. It's actually bringing, because it exists and it's sovereign, and you can already see the lack of piracy in Somaliland history, the free trade, and all these nice things that Somaliland offers.
Do you believe that the conflict in Yemen has been an impediment, or do you think, on the other hand, that it could be actually an opportunity?
Yeah, it could be both. So Somaliland is, surrounded by very much unstable dictatorships or, conflict areas. Just the Houthis very much close to Somaliland. So a conflict can arise from there. Any friction can lead to a conflict, and Somaliland needs that support to have the weapons and the ability to defend itself in case something happens. So a lot of countries have been sympathizers with Somaliland, and they will offer de facto recognition. Is one of the points I raised in the article, but that does not help Somaliland to protect itself and spend good amount of its budget on weapons and enhancing its own military abilities. This is again because Somalia is under arm embargo, and that means they can buy, except funnily enough, only the central government of Somalia is the one that can buy weapons, which is kind of funny. So this is what the world has led Somaliland with, and this is what we are talking about. There's not just the Houthi, but also you can see the war in Ethiopia. It can go in any side, and you can have militias or any actor jumping on and causing trouble to Somaliland. You can see at the west of Ethiopia how chaotic it has been, with Eritrea being involved, and then Sudan. So what is stopping Somaliland from being also apart from that conflict? So again, Somaliland needs that support in the north against the Houthis, and with the insurgencies in Ethiopia, and also definitely Somalia, which is again, so it's surrounded by a lot of unstable region, and it's really the time that Somaliland should be fully recognized, so that it can defend itself, being sovereign and being able to do things by yourself is a very core idea to Somalilanders, and they will love to protect their countries. And they proved that against the dictator back in the 80s. So to come short, de facto recognition does not give that to Somaliland. And that's why, to your question, with the Houthi, and we saw that what happened just last week with that attack on a ship from UAE. So this is the backyard of Somaliland. So anytime a conflict can arise.
While starting to pursue the discussion, the dialogue with the United States, has Somaliland also been working on bilateral recognition from African states, following up on the report, given that there hasn't been any independent kind of follow-up from those states following the recommendation to establish a process?
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat that?
Has there been a bilateral outreach to African states while also pursuing the U.S. kind of an approach to the US policy circles? Because
Yes.
that kind of brings me to the different approaches you've outlined in your article.
Yeah, that's true. So Somaliland is reaching out to all this. So as I explained, Somaliland is not just an African state. It belongs to a wider region with many actors that are interested in, and that's why the United States is one of them. But also, yeah, you're right that Somaliland has actually reached out to multiple African countries. So in 1 year or 2 years ago, Somaliland had a new relationship with Kenya, which is a sort of a de facto relations that Somaliland looks forward to become a full recognition, and we're expecting an office from Kenya to be opened soon in Hargeisa, and there's already one in Nairobi, and we talk about trade deals, and there's a lot of diaspora from Kenyan citizens who live inside Somaliland and work there. So yes, Somaliland is pursuing as well in the background with multiple African states. But that again, it's a question for the whole world, right? So we talk about international recognition, and it should never be a question of a prerequisite that some countries should be first within Africa first, and then my argument is that it's a question for everyone. It's an international recognition question, and Somaliland does really affect the wider region than Africa, and that's why it also pursuing all channels. Somalia is not just tunneling on or anchoring on only the US, but it's reaching out to multiple countries in different continents.
So you've, in your article, following up on that, you've outlined several different roadmaps that that could potentially define U.S. relationship with Somaliland. You mentioned the suggested talks with Somalia, with the AU, the African Union sponsorship, the UK treatment, which is de facto but not official recognition, a possibility of a direct recognition, and the model of the Abraham Accords. Could you elaborate what you had in mind by describing these potential roadmaps? And you also mentioned that that none of them are exactly the same as a win-win deal. Can you elaborate on what you had in mind?
Yeah, sure. So before I talk about these four, I will just quickly mention what are because now we're talking about just the United States and Somaliland. So what are actually the interests between the two countries? So first interest is the Berbera port. It provides, it could be a very important navy for the and military base for the United States instead of Djibouti, which has been, used a lot by the Chinese government. So it's now becoming this region to the state that they shouldn't be together in that place. But also, it actually can replace the Qatar military base, the US military base in Qatar, because the war on Afghanistan has ended, the war in Iraq is over. So it's about time to maybe consolidate that base to be one in Berbera. And what that gives is deep waters that doesn't, you won't have that deep water in the Arab Gulf. So that's one thing. There's one interest. So another one is democracy. Somaliland is the only democracy in the Horn of Africa. It's really to the same level of Kenya, but I expect within 2022, with the recent elections that happened and the opening of new bodies, Somaliland might actually also be the first in the wider East Africa region. So with the Biden administration call for advancing democracy everywhere, definitely Somaliland is the role model for the East African community. So the third one is obviously the relationship with Taiwan. Somaliland has forced relationship with Taiwan, and that was based on the shared values between the two countries, and that has angered China, and China tried to change Somaliland mind by offering it's again debt trap diplomacy, and Somaliland rejected that. Seeing what happened with Somalia and seeing what happened with Djibouti, it's very clear what that relationship would be. And so Somaliland is actually showing the world how we could compete with China in a way that is not hostile again. Somaliland did not recognize Taiwan as the only government representing Chinese people, so it was following the same de facto relationship that everyone has with Taiwan, while not playing or invoking China with recognition. But unfortunately, China responded, as you know, with you know abusive way of dealing with countries like Lithuania now. But Somaliland suffered that first, and you will see that China tried to impose some sort of one Somalia policy, which doesn't exist, and again, which is against the African Union fact-finding mission. So that's the third interest that the U.S. has, is to make that momentum uh, to to uh, to stand up against China, which a lot of African countries need. So these are the interests. Now back to the roadmaps or the options that the US has to materialize these interests. First is the talks with Somalia. So former ambassador to Somalia uh, has made a suggestion that maybe the talks that's been for 10 years could be now sponsored more directly by the African Union, and they could give timeline and give pressure on both sides. But that's actually, again, actually adding insult to the injury. And what it's causing is it's saying that Somaliland has to ask permission from Somalia. Somaliland's already independent, so the question is not with Somalia at all. So that approach is actually, first of all, an insult to Somaliland. It's against the AU fact-finding mission, which says Somaliland is different and it shouldn't be treated as a secessionist group asking for permission from a parent state. So that's it's wrong. And the second thing that is, it's 10 years and nothing has happened, and it's also blocking any other channel for recognition. So if Somaliland took that idea, it's going to cause more problems. The second roadmap is a de facto, which is what was happening with the UK, UAE, Ethiopia, Djibouti to a degree. So Somaliland has already forced this. So the United States kind of have an advantage here by being the last, because it can look at what this has given to these countries. And obviously, not every country has the same interests. So the UK has a different interest than the United States. The United States is more, as I talked, more global issues that it wants to see and transformations that it wants to see in this region. And UK could follow that, seeing the US leading towards that. So everyone was expecting the US to be the final one, as a global superpower to take this action. So if the United States also becomes another entity that says, "I'll go for de facto," that's actually doesn't give much progress to the Somaliland issue. The another thing is that it will lead to no result, because Somalilanders are asking themselves what the relationship with Taiwan has given Somaliland. Obviously, it's given better than China has give to other countries like Somalia and Djibouti. The relationship with Taiwan is great. A lot of investments it's been talked about recently in oil and gas field, and scholarships and programs and etc. But China is still there and is trying to come back. And one of the opposition parties is actually calling for switching sides again. So that puts a pressure on the US to really think about a complete package, and the de facto doesn't cut it. It doesn't give that assurance and solidify the relationship with Somaliland. We could imagine that the United States, with the de facto, it could give some economic deals with Somaliland, but that also won't be as effective as China. China will pour investments because of the structure that it has. Supposedly, we know that, at least on paper, but in the US, you would not get that leverage. And what you expect from the US is actually an open economy. And if companies try to come to Somaliland straight off, they will see that, well, there is no banking system that is integrated with the world. They will actually see the problems that Somaliland talk about due to lack of recognition. So again, de facto with just few economic deals will not even give that value that Somaliland is looking for. Another thing is Somaliland's ability to defend itself, which we talked about. De facto doesn't give that, because you will be able, Somaliland will not be able to buy weapons or have training programs with different countries. Now we come to the last two. So while writing this, I was thinking that I will end up with a win-lose sort of deal. But what I found is that it's either lose-lose, where both Somaliland and the United States don't materialize their interest. And that's what we've been talking about now with the talks and the de facto. It's not good for any of the two countries. So now the later two ones is actually the ones that are promising. So we talk about direct independence, and that means that the United States immediately recognizes Somaliland. And this is the most popular, by the way. When you look at in my research and you look what's there out there, you'll see many think tanks, many advocates, 3 former U.S. Secretary of State, for Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, have called for Somaliland to be recognized fully. So there's a big momentum there. But obviously, it's not, while there has been good research about that, there's no problems. And one thing is, like, Somaliland is in a region that you can call that similar to a game of Jenga. So Somaliland has been treated with this little stick that if you move it, everything is going to collide and everything will fall apart. But what happened is the war on Ethiopia has already happened without Somaliland being involved, and also Somalia is in a chaos. So all of a sudden people started to notice, well, we were trying to, isolate Somaliland by not touching it, hoping that it will cause problems, but actually problems happen everywhere. So now's the time that Somaliland should be recognized. And this direct recognition gives hope to a lot of people in the Horn of Africa that if you're democratic, if you're peaceful, you will get, you will go ahead and be active and a responsible member in the international community, but not necessarily through being an independent country, because again, as I mentioned, Somaliland does not give any roadmap for others to follow and become independent. The last one is the Abraham Accord, and this is a really one that has been also advocated more recently with Dr. Adna, and also Michael Rubin has written about this. And the idea here is that Somaliland and Israel already have a lot of similarities. Both are, successful democracies that are, in a neighborhood that is not democratic and not welcomed to a degree. So they both can share that background, and in the same time, the Abraham Accord has helped Sudan, for example, to end the sections of Sudan, and this gives a really useful tool. As opposed to, for example, the direct recognition, the United States has to, although there's no problems there, but one small note is that the United States have to explain its positions to many countries, which I've been talking about in the past 45 minutes. So the same thing, the United States will need to explain its positions to many countries. And this is, again, Somaliland has limited resources. It didn't send the message or, give its story well to many countries. It did what it can, but still that's missing. So that weight will be on the shoulders of diplomats if US recognize Somaliland. But there's no other problems at all. But when you look at the Abraham Accord, it's actually the only party you're talking about is Israel. And that 3 countries actually share a lot already, common values. And that will lead to obviously better, maybe a more practical way forward for these 3 countries.
So would that work like basically Israel and US recognition in exchange for Somaliland basically joining the accord and joining that alliance with everything that entails?
Yeah.
Would
Yes.
that mean?
Yeah, definitely. And there are a lot of things that could be established between Somaliland and Israel. So obviously the biggest benefiter in this relationship is United States and Somaliland. We haven't explored yet, actually, what is the benefits of Israel to pursue relationship with Somaliland, apart from what we talked about, democracy and stability, which is important for every country in the world. But what's more for Israel? So we could talk about, the livestock market that Somaliland provides. Israel imports a lot of livestock, and Somaliland is also an exporter. So that's a perfect match there. For example, Somaliland has also a lot to gain from here, because last year, due to COVID, a lot of pilgrimage to Mecca hasn't happened. And that meant that Somaliland did not export a lot of livestock, and that hurt the economy of Somaliland. So this is another channel. Instead of just relying on one export market, it can also use Israel. And there's a lot of agriculture and uh, opportunities in Somaliland, and mining and so many things. It's untapped resources in Somaliland that invite a lot of people to come and invest. And Somaliland is obviously, when you look at the history, it doesn't like aid. It doesn't like just, being poured with money. Somaliland is very much like a startup nation. They like to do things themselves. They like to make business. And we haven't talked about the DB World deal with the United Arab Emirates that has been a very important investment. It kind of shows the kind of things that Somaliland is looking for.
I actually think the unexplored opportunities that you just mentioned should be kind of advertised more in terms of providing kind of the whole package approach to the countries. But I wanted to ask you this. I know that there is a presidential visit to the United States that's coming up. Has there also been any plans for trilateral talks between Israel, US, and Somaliland to discuss this idea?
Yeah, this is all in a work in progress. There hasn't been anything that happened, but this is one of the part of my role as an activist, and all the other research institutes as well. This is the time that we could put forward the scenarios, the possibilities. There's a lot we can do by not being involved in the government, in both governments, and this is where we need to as a community to come together and have these kind of discussions. But yeah, as of my knowledge, yeah.
And my other related question to that, has there been sort of a discussion between Somaliland and, leaving aside the US, specifically the Abraham Accord member countries who are already kind of part of that original discussion, because they on the other could essentially be co-lobbyists pushing for this relationship if they're convinced that it's in their interest to have another independent member with them. So that could actually facilitate the talks with the US if the other Abraham Accord countries are on board and can be persuaded to support this approach.
Yes, a lot of analysts and experts in international affairs say that it just takes one country, major country, and namely James Killinsey, who has a great YouTube channel on independence and secession everywhere. He touched on this Somaliland topic, and he said if only one country recognizes Somaliland, all countries will follow suit. There's a lot of sympathy with Somaliland case, and you're right that it's very easy to bring in more countries as well into the table, and it will be very much a very welcomed progress for the world.
The reason why I bring this up is because this particular administration has emphasized multilateralism in their diplomatic approach, and it seems to me that yes, it's important to have the direct discussions between on the highest level. At the same time, I think having support from a group of potential allies can also be an effective tool to leverage the potential support from the administration, which otherwise might not be either convinced or prioritize this particular issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And yes, it's one of the tools that we have available is to involve multiple countries. So you see how, for example, the Quad being formed earlier this year or last year. And that means, these countries are interested about an open and free Indo-Pacific. And Somaliland plays a part in that. So obviously, you're right there that as a government, as advocates, we should be reaching out more to more countries and not just the United States, obviously. But Somaliland profile really sits well with multiple countries, and it is really the way forward.
I actually wanted to go over some of the criteria that you mentioned, and the one thing that US is going to be very wary about is the potential for adverse actions by Somalia or other regional actors who may be opposed to this particular juncture. They essentially are already sort of not, dealing with complexities from the civil war in Ethiopia, and there are complications in Sudan. There, U.S. is having other issues in the region. How best to address the potential for opposition from Somalia in terms of the U.S. gaining US support?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So obviously the timing has to be right. We it's very clear that the implication on Somalia is nothing. Somalia will try to influence and obviously will be very upset with this. But it's been the fact on the ground for more than 30 years. And we talked about exactly the history there. And again, it's a very important thing to notice that the ruling on Kosovo has been very clear that declaring independence is not against the international law, and the recognition of that is a political choice for any country in the world to recognize a country. And when we are doing that, we're not saying that anyone will secede and should be recognized. This is within the context of Somaliland, which we explained that does not lead to any other problems elsewhere. Obviously, the war in Ethiopia is a concern, and people will argue for both side of the angles that recognition of Somaliland actually gives hope for democracy and shows that the right way to govern and have a stable and peace is actually with democratic and free expression in this region. It's not something for Europe or the United States. It's something for Africa. And the democracy in Somaliland has been, we talk about pastoral democracy in Somaliland, and some argue it's one of the oldest democracies in the world. So it's not an imported idea. It's just next door and something that will help Ethiopia to be more stable. So it's actually part of the solution. But obviously, this is beyond me, obviously, but the timing, when should it be done? That's again, can be worked out. But what we need first is the intention. If we get to the degree that the United States agrees that Somalia should be recognized, and now the question of when it can be resolved, obviously, at the right time.
Well, the biggest issue, of course, from the US perspective, any administration, whoever is in office at any given point in time, whenever they take a very important step, to them, it's important to present whatever it is as a win, as a huge accomplishment that secures their legacy and essentially secures what they claim to stand for when they came to office. So I think from Somaliland's perspective, presenting this case in light of the administration's own stated priorities, that's addressing that and how this recognition will fit into this vision, this rhetoric, these election promises to U.S. constituents and benefit the U.S. I think that's basically going to be the breaking point of that discussion. And I'm not going to lie, that might be a process that may take several years and may even lead into some other administration should there be a change of power in 2024, for instance, because given the given all the issues that are being currently juggled, I'm not sure that it's going to be a very fast decision-making process. But it doesn't mean it's not worth doing, especially. But I do think that Somaliland should not exclusively rely on US to buy into this argument. I think it should be working with other countries to kind of convince the US that there is already a regional or international level of support or interest and and there are other stakeholders kind of buying into that. Frankly, all these separate points that you made in the article are important. The fact that Turkey is supplying Somalia with drones and there's a potential for increased conflict, that's an important point. The support from various other alliances like the Quad that you mentioned, the potential for greater destabilization and avoiding destabilization through potential aggression from other countries. Those are also arguments, but I think they would work effectively if argued as how they affect not just Somaliland and its own interest, but also regional interests for the US and what the US can get out of avoiding those additional problems. So in that respect, I think this case that's already being made, I think, could be further advanced by follow-up scholarship on the regional impact of Somaliland's independence and how that's a win-win for kind of a stakeholder of democracies and pro-democracy states seeking to cooperate closely with the US and others. I think that could be an effective next step in advancing this argument from what I see. But I wanted to wrap up the discussion by asking you what, in your opinion, are the direct next steps. Uh, when is the next visit that is being discussed coming up, and do you expect the independence issue to be brought up during this visit, or is it more of an introductory kind of bilateral meeting?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much for your analysis and feedback there. I think I agree with all the points you've raised there. For your question, right now we're talking about there will be a visit to the United States by His Excellency Musa Bihi. That would be around the beginning of the early March, and also before that, you would talk about a visit to Ethiopia. There are another country I heard as well, but I don't want to disclose it because it's not yet confirmed. But what you see from this administration is really sincerely, they are serious about recognition. And that's the first thing they will talk about. We have a full trust in the government that it will pursue nothing but full recognition. What we're trying to do here, as people who advocate or scholars, is to lay out what exactly is going to happen and what are the scenarios and what are the options available. But in terms of the policy of the Somaliland government is clearly full recognition. And as you mentioned, this is something that Somaliland must pursue, regardless if it doesn't happen this year or next year. It's something Somalilanders are ready to fight for multiple decades to come, and not just years. So yes, I think the first steps is now for us to have the conclusion, because sometimes there are voices that would say, well, let's just get de facto recognition, or let's continue the talks. Although these are the minority, it's important that all the advocates, the embassies, the decision makers in multiple capitals, to come to the same conclusion that nothing really works as good as a full recognition. And Somaliland is not a country that we are creating today. It's been there arguably for many, many years, and now in the recent history for 31 years. So it's already proven, and it's just a matter of accepting the reality on the ground.
Well, thank you very much. That was really an excellent presentation, very informative, especially for those in the audience who are either completely unaware of these circumstances or have been misled by rhetoric or just by inaccurate presentation, and simply didn't know much and made assumptions about what's going on, what's not going on, and maybe kind of concerned. I think this was a great way of doing that. I really hope to have more discussions in the months to follow on the process and what more can be done, what are the diplomatic efforts, are the developments, and I look forward to discussing them and look forward to your future work as well.
Thanks, Irina. Thank you for doing this and giving us this opportunity to explain Somaliland and US relations. Very much looking forward for your next work on this subject.
Thank you so much, and have a great day, and thank you so much for joining us at the horrendous hour your time in Australia. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.